3 million men. That is how many soldiers marched east on a single summer morning in 1941. And almost none of them knew. They were walking straight into their own graves. It is 3:15 in the morning, June the 22nd. The border between German-held Poland and the Soviet Union. For miles in every direction, the darkness is packed with steel. Tanks, trucks, horses, guns the size of houses. The largest invasion force ever assembled in human history is holding its breath in the dark. And the men are smiling. Because these are not frightened boys. These are the soldiers who broke France in 6 weeks. The army that walked into Paris and took photographs. They have conquered Poland, Norway, Belgium, Holland. They have never lost. Not once. To them, war is a thing you win by breakfast. So when they look east, into the black fields of Russia, they do not feel fear. They feel contempt. Their leaders have told them the truth, and the truth is simple. The Soviet Union is rotten, a giant made of cardboard, a nation of peasants led by butchers, defended by an army too stupid to hold a rifle correctly. Hitler himself has said the words that every man in every trench has heard passed down the line. We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. Kick in the door. That is the plan. That is all it will take. At 3:15 exactly, the order comes. And the world tears open. Thousands of guns fire at the same instant. The horizon turns white. The ground shakes so hard that men feel it in their teeth. Shells scream over the front line and land in Soviet barracks where boys are still asleep. The first minutes of the invasion are not a battle. They are a slaughter. The Germans pour across the border, and for a while, it works. Just like France. The Red Army breaks and runs. Prisoners surrender in the thousands, then the tens of thousands. The smiling men keep smiling. Then, somewhere on a dusty road, a German gunner sees a shape coming toward him. A tank. He does what he was trained to do. He fires. And the shell bounces off. He fires again. It sparks and skids away into the sky. The thing does not slow down. It does not burn. It rolls over his gun like it isn't there. That gunner has just met a machine his generals were warned about and chose to ignore. A weapon so crude that experts laughed at it. Built by a man they nearly fired. Waiting for them was a tank they could not kill, a winter they refused to prepare for, and a country big enough to swallow 3 million men whole. This is the story of the door Hitler kicked in. And the tomb on the other side. To understand the disaster, you first have to understand the confidence. By the summer of 1941, the German army was the most feared fighting machine on the planet. And it had earned that fear. They had a way of war the world had never seen. They called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Here is what it meant, in plain terms. Old wars were slow. 2 armies would sit in trenches and grind each other into mud for years. Blitzkrieg refused to play that game. Instead of pushing everywhere at once, the Germans punched one small hole in the enemy line with tanks, then poured everything through that hole before the enemy even understood what was happening. Fast tanks. Radios in every vehicle. Dive bombers acting like flying artillery. Speed on top of speed on top of speed. The enemy never got to think. And an army that cannot think panics. And an army that panics surrenders. It had worked in Poland. It had worked in France, against a bigger army, in 6 stunning weeks. So the German high command looked at their record and reached a fatal conclusion. It will work in Russia too. But Russia was not France. Russia was the problem no general in history had ever solved. Start with the size. France, you could drive across in a day. Russia was so vast it broke the mind. A German tank could drive for a week and still be nowhere. The plan needed the panzers to reach 3 cities at once: Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center. The oil fields in the south, each one hundreds of miles apart, across roads that were mostly just dirt. Then add the clock. Because in Russia there is an enemy that arrives every single year on schedule, and it is called winter. Not cold like a cold morning. Cold that kills. Cold that snaps steel. The German plan had no room for it. The whole invasion was built on one desperate bet: win before the snow. Smash the Soviet Union in a few months, before autumn, before the roads froze, before the temperature dropped below the point where men and machines simply stop. And history was screaming a warning. Because one man had tried this before. Napoleon, in 1812, the greatest general of his age, marched an enormous army into Russia. He even took Moscow. And Russia destroyed him anyway. It let him march in, then bled him white with distance, and hunger, and snow. His army walked in proud. It crawled out as a frozen skeleton. Every educated officer in the German army knew this story. They convinced themselves it did not apply to them. Why? Because they believed the Soviet Union was already broken from the inside. And here is the tragedy: they had reasons to believe it. Just a few years earlier, Stalin had turned on his own army in a fit of paranoia and murdered his best officers by the thousands. Generals, colonels, the men who knew how to fight, shot or sent to freeze in prison camps. The Red Army had been beheaded by its own leader. And then, in a small war against tiny Finland, that same crippled army had performed so badly that the whole world laughed. So the Germans made their bet. A giant that had cut off its own head. A peasant army that couldn't beat Finland against the men who took Paris. Kick in the door. They were about to learn that the giant had been building something in the dark. For the first weeks, it looked like the Germans were right. The Red Army did not just lose. It collapsed. Whole armies were surrounded and captured. At Minsk, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers vanished into German prison camps. At Smolensk, hundreds of thousands more. And then came Kiev, where over 600,000 Soviet troops were trapped in a single steel ring, the largest encirclement of soldiers in the history of the world. 600,000 men. In one pocket. Gone. The newspapers of the world wrote the obituary. The Soviet Union is finished. It is a matter of weeks, maybe days. But out of that catastrophe, two men were rising, two underdogs the German high command had never heard of. And both of them had been mocked, doubted, or nearly thrown away. The first was a soldier, a blunt, brutal, thick-necked general named Georgy Zhukov. He was not a gentleman. He did not come from a fine family. He had been a poor boy, a fur worker's apprentice, before the army made him. He had survived Stalin's purges by pure luck and pure nerve, watching better-born men be dragged away and shot. He was rude. He was ruthless. He shouted at politicians. Stalin found him almost impossible to like. But Zhukov had one gift that would matter more than charm. He did not panic. When everyone around him was drowning in fear, his mind stayed cold and clear. And he understood something the Germans did not. You do not beat Russia's enemies by being clever. You beat them by holding on, by bleeding them, by trading space and men and time until the winter does your killing for you. The second man was not a soldier at all. He was an engineer. And his name was Mikhail Koshkin. Koshkin worked in a tank factory in the city of Kharkov, and he had an obsession. He believed he could build a tank unlike anything on Earth, not the thin little tin can tanks of the 1930s. Something new. Something with thick, angled armor, a huge gun, and tracks wide enough to float across mud and snow. And the powerful men above him did not want it. They thought his ideas were too radical, too strange. There were older designs they preferred, safer designs, and there was pressure to shut Koshkin down. Worse, this was Stalin's Russia, the country where being wrong or even being different could get you arrested in the night and shot as a saboteur. To push a design nobody asked for was to risk your life. Koshkin pushed anyway. And when the officials would not come to see his tank, he made a decision that sounds insane. He would bring the tank to them. He would drive his prototypes across the country through the freezing early spring, hundreds of miles of frozen road and mud and snow, all the way to Moscow to prove in person that the machine was real. He did it. He drove through brutal cold to put his tank in front of the Kremlin. And it cost him everything. Somewhere on that long, frozen ordeal, Koshkin got sick. A cold turned into pneumonia. His lungs failed. He was operated on. It was not enough. In the autumn of 1940, Mikhail Koshkin died. He was just 41 years old. He never saw the war. He never saw a single one of his tanks in battle. He died months before 3 million Germans crossed the border, never knowing that the machine he gave his life for was about to become the most important weapon of the entire war. So what was this tank? To the German soldiers who first saw it, it looked like a joke. Remember, the Germans took pride in engineering. Their tanks were precise, beautiful, almost smooth welds, fine steel. Machines built like expensive watches. To them, quality meant refinement. The Soviet tank was the opposite of refined. It looked rough, crude, the welds were ugly and uneven, like they'd been done in a hurry by tired men who didn't care what it looked like. The finish was raw. To a German officer, it looked like a peasant had built a tank in a barn. They laughed. It was called the T-34. And here is the thing about that ugly, crude peasant machine. It was nearly unkillable. Let me explain why, without a single spec sheet, because the secret was not in the numbers. It was in 3 simple ideas. The first idea was sloped armor. On most tanks of the time, the armor stood up straight, flat, like a wall. When a shell hits a straight wall, it hits with its full force and punches through. The T-34's armor was tilted back at an angle. And a shell that hits a slope doesn't punch. It skids, it glances off and flies away into the air, the same way a stone skips off water instead of sinking. So the Germans would fire a perfect shot, dead on target, and watch it bounce off into the sky. The second idea was the tracks. German tanks had narrow tracks, fine on a nice European road. But Russia in the wrong season isn't a road. It's a swamp. Narrow tracks sink into it like a knife into butter, and the tank gets stuck. Helpless, the T-34's tracks were wide, really wide. They spread the weight out, so the tank floated over mud and snow that swallowed everything else. Where German panzers drowned in the muck, the T-34 just kept coming. The third idea was the gun and the engine. The T-34 carried a big, powerful gun that could smash straight through German tanks from far away, and it ran on a diesel engine instead of gasoline. That mattered more than it sounds. Gasoline catches fire fast. A hit gasoline tank turns a crew into a fireball. Diesel is far harder to light, so the T-34 could take a hit and keep fighting when a German tank would already be burning. Now put yourself in the German gunner's boots. You have the best anti-tank gun you were given. A small, quick 37mm gun. In France, it killed everything. You trust it with your life. You fire it at a T-34. Nothing. The shell bounces. The tank keeps rolling. You fire again. Nothing. Again. Nothing. That little gun bounced off so uselessly that the German soldiers gave it a bitter nickname of their own. They called it the door knocker, because all it did was knock politely on the enemy's armor and announce that you were about to die. The joke tank. The barn-built peasant machine that experts had laughed at. It had just made the finest army in the world feel helpless. But the deepest wound the East inflicted was not to German bodies. It was to the German mind. Because an army does not run on tanks and fuel alone. It runs on belief. These men believed they were unbeatable. That belief was their real armor. And Russia set out, slowly, to strip it away. It started with the tanks. Word spread from unit to unit, whispered, unofficial, the way real fear always travels. There is a Russian tank you cannot kill. Your guns don't work on it. You hit it clean, and it drives through you. Think about what that does to a soldier's soul. Everything you were taught, everything that kept you alive, suddenly doesn't. You aim. You fire the perfect shot. And the monster keeps coming anyway. Veterans who had crushed France, men who had never once felt afraid, now felt something crawl into their stomachs. Something new. Then the land itself turned against them. First came the mud. In autumn, the rains hit Russia, and the dirt roads dissolved into a bottomless brown soup. The Russians even had a word for this season, the time when the country turns to mush. And it was a catastrophe for an army built on speed. Trucks sank to the axles. Guns sank. Tanks bogged down and sat there roaring, throwing up mud, going nowhere. Men had to wade through it, pulling their own boots out with their hands at every step. The lightning war, the whole idea of speed, drowned in the mud. And then the mud froze. And that was so much worse. The cold that came for the Germans in the winter of 1941 is hard to even describe. 40 degrees below zero. Cold that is not weather. Cold that is a weapon. Here is what that kind of cold actually does, in plain, human terms. Metal becomes deadly to touch. Grab a rifle or a door handle with a bare hand, and your skin freezes to it and tears off. The oil inside engines turns thick like glue, so tanks and trucks simply will not start. Men have to light fires under them just to wake the engine. The bolt on a rifle freezes solid, so when the moment comes to shoot, the gun will not fire. And the men were still wearing their summer uniforms. Let that sink in. The German high command was so arrogant, so certain the war would be over by autumn, that they had not sent proper winter clothing to the front. So while Russians fought in thick padded coats and felt boots, German soldiers stuffed newspaper into their tunics and wrapped their feet in rags and froze. Men lost fingers, toes, whole feet to frostbite. Some fell asleep in the snow and simply never woke up, frozen where they lay. And it was not only the men. People picture the German army as a wall of tanks, but most of it did not move on tracks at all. It moved on horses. Hundreds of thousands of them, dragging the guns and the wagons and the supplies. And a horse cannot read a battle plan. The horses starved. They froze standing up in their harnesses. They died in the traces by the thousand, and were left where they dropped, stiff gray shapes along every road the Germans had marched down so proudly in the summer. The machine that had roared into Russia like lightning was, by the deep of winter, a shuffling column of frostbitten men and dying animals, dragging itself through a white silence that stretched further in every direction than the eye could bear to look. And underneath it all was the most horrifying thing of all: the numbers. The Germans would destroy a Soviet army, wipe it out, surround it, capture it, congratulate themselves. And then another one would appear, and another. It never ended. However many they killed, more came. The whispered joke among frightened German soldiers stopped being a joke. We are going to run out of bullets before they run out of men. That is when a proud army begins to break. Not all at once. Quietly, elite soldiers, the pride of Germany, stopped thinking about victory and started thinking only about surviving the night, about their frozen feet, about the endless white nothing in every direction, and the tanks they couldn't kill, and the enemy that could not die. They had come to kick in a door. Now the door was closing behind them. Everything came to a head in front of one city. Moscow, December 1941. The German army, frozen, exhausted, half-starved, had clawed its way to the very edge of the Soviet capital. Some forward units were so close they could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars, glinting in the freezing air. Victory looked close enough to touch. But they had nothing left. The men were spent. The tanks were frozen. The great engine of Blitzkrieg had finally run out of fuel and warmth and hope, right at the finish line. And on the other side of that line stood Zhukov. The blunt, brutal general had been quietly preparing a knife to plunge into Germany's back. And his greatest advantage came from a single piece of information. Deep in Japan, a Soviet spy had learned a crucial secret: Japan was not going to attack the Soviet Union from the east. It was going to strike elsewhere. That meant the huge Soviet army guarding the far eastern border, in Siberia, was suddenly free. And these were not broken, beaten men. These were fresh Siberian divisions. Troops raised in the coldest corner of the earth. Men to whom 40 below was just another winter. They came dressed for it: thick white coats, warm boots, some on skis, ghosts in the snow. And Zhukov moved them in total secrecy right across the country to the gates of Moscow. Then, on a frozen December morning, he unleashed them. Fresh, winter-hardened Siberian soldiers. Waves of T-34 tanks that floated over the snow and shrugged off German shells. And screaming out of the sky, a terrifying new weapon, rocket launchers the Germans nicknamed Stalin's organ, which fired dozens of rockets at once with a howl that froze the blood. They slammed into the exhausted, freezing Germans, and the invincible army broke. For the first time in the entire war, the German Blitzkrieg was not just stopped. It was thrown backwards, driven back from Moscow across the snow, leaving frozen bodies and abandoned tanks behind. The spell was broken. The myth of the unbeatable German army died in the snow outside Moscow. And here is the part that should make you angry, because so much of this suffering was a choice. One man's arrogance. German generals, the professionals, had begged for the drive on Moscow to come first and fast, before winter. Instead, at the critical moment, Hitler had pulled his tanks away to go win a different, more glamorous battle in the south. He won that battle. But he lost the race against the calendar. The delay cost the Germans the one thing they could never get back: time. And the winter clothing. His own commanders knew their men would freeze. But Hitler had insisted the war would be over before it mattered. So the warm coats and boots sat in warehouses far to the west, while his soldiers lost their feet to frostbite at the front. And when the counterattack came, and the smart move was to pull back to safety, Hitler forbade it. No retreat. Stand and die where you are. And so more men froze, and more men died, holding ground that meant nothing, because one man could not admit he had been wrong. Hundreds of thousands of German casualties. Well over 100,000 cases of frostbite alone. A generation of young men fed into the snow, not because the enemy was unbeatable, but because the man in charge believed his own boast. Kick in the door. And when the door turned out to be solid stone, he kept ordering his men to run at it head first, until the snow was red. The invasion that was supposed to last a few weeks lasted almost 4 years. And it did not end in Moscow. It ended in Berlin. In 1945, it was Zhukov, the blunt, unloved underdog general, who led the final assault on Hitler's capital and raised the red flag over the ruins of the men who once laughed at his army. The T-34 rolled all the way there with him. That ugly, crude, barn-built peasant tank became the most produced tank of the entire war. Tens of thousands of them poured out of Soviet factories, more than the Germans could ever hope to match, and they ground the greatest army in the world into scrap and bone across 1,000 frozen miles. And Mikhail Koshkin, the engineer who gave his life for it, never saw any of it. He died in the autumn quiet of 1940, coughing his lungs out in a hospital bed. A man his bosses had wanted to silence. He never knew that the machine he drove across the frozen country would help save that same country from destruction. He never got to see his tank become a legend. He just paid for it, quietly, with his life, and vanished from the story he had saved. And the 3 million? So many of them never came home. They were swallowed by the very land they had mocked from the safety of their trenches, buried in Russian fields, frozen in Russian snow, lost in a country so vast it simply absorbed them, the way it had absorbed Napoleon's army a lifetime before. To this day, farmers in those old battlefields still turn up their bones and their helmets in the soil. Now go back. Go back to that summer morning. 3:15, June the 22nd. The border in the dark. 3 million men holding their breath, and every one of them smiling. The soldiers who took Paris, looking east at a country they were certain was made of cardboard, told by their leader that all it would take was one good kick. Watching, in those first proud hours, as their perfect shells bounced uselessly off an ugly tank they didn't understand, built by a dead man they'd never heard of. They thought they were kicking in a door. They never understood, not until the snow was falling, and their feet were black, and the endless enemy kept coming, that the door they kicked in so proudly was the door to their own grave.